When a gambling-addicted mother dragged her 15-year-old daughter to the slave auction block to pay off her mounting debts, the crowd expected another tragic sale to the highest bidder. What they didn't expect was the silent Apache rancher who emerged from the shadows with enough silver to buy the girl's freedom, or the shocking reason why he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Millfield, Arizona Territory in the scorching summer of 1887. But inside the cramped, airless cabin on the outskirts of town, 16-year-old Elena Reyes pressed her face against the cracked window pane, watching. Her mother, Consuela, stumbled up the wooden steps. Even from a distance, Elena could see the telltale signs. The unsteady gait, the disheveled hair, the way her mother clutched a nearly empty bottle of whiskey like it was her lifeline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's stomach clenched with familiar dread. When Consuela drank, which had become increasingly frequent since Papa's death 3 years ago, the violence always followed. But today felt different. There was something in her mother's posture, a desperate edge to her movements that made Elena's skin crawl with apprehension. The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, leaving a new dent in the already battered wood. Consuela Reyes staggered inside, her once beautiful face now bloated and marked with the telltale signs of chronic alcoholism. Her dark eyes, which had once sparkled with life and love for her family, now burned. With a mixture of rage and something far more terrifying, cold calculation. "Elena!" Consuela's voice cracked like a whip through the small space. "Get over here now!" Elena had learned long ago that hesitation only made things worse. She approached her mother cautiously, the way one might approach a wounded animal, slowly, carefully, ready to flee at the first sign of violence. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed skin hit her like a physical blow, making her eyes water. "Mama, you're drunk again. Maybe you should lie down," and the slap came so fast Elena barely saw it coming. The impact sent her stumbling backward, her cheek burning with pain. But worse than the physical pain was the look in her mother's eyes. Mom, there was no remorse, no recognition of what she'd just done, only cold, calculating indifference. "Don't you dare tell me what to do, you worthless little brat," Consuela snarled, swaying slightly as she pointed an accusatory finger at her. "Daughter, you think you're better than me? You think you can judge me?" Elena touched her stinging cheek, feeling the heat radiating from where her mother's hand had connected. This wasn't new. The hitting had started shortly after Papa's funeral and had only gotten worse as Consuela's drinking escalated. But there was something different in her mother's voice today, something that made Elena's blood run cold. "I found out something interesting today at Rosa's cantina," Consuela continued, her words slurring slightly as she took another swig from the bottle. "Seems there's been talk about you around town, about how you're growing up to be quite the beauty." Elena felt her stomach drop. She'd noticed the way some of the men in town had started looking at her differently in recent months, their gazes lingering too long, their comments growing increasingly inappropriate. She'd tried to stay close to home, to avoid drawing attention, but in a town as small as Millfield, there was nowhere to hide. "Mama, I don't like the way you're talking. Please, just tell me what's wrong. Maybe I can help." "Help?" Consuela let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no warmth whatsoever. "Oh, you're going to help, all right. You're going to help solve all our problems." She stumbled toward the small wooden table where Papa used to sit and read his newspaper. Every morning, back when they were still a family, back when love still lived in this house. Now the table was covered with empty bottles, overdue bills, and IOUs written in Consuela's increasingly desperate handwriting. "You see all this?" Consuela gestured wildly at the papers scattered across the table. "This is what your precious Papa left us with. Debts. mountains of debts. And now the bank is coming for the house. The creditors are circling like vultures, and I owe money to people who don't take kindly to being kept waiting. Elena had known things were bad financially. They'd been eating beans and stale bread for weeks, and she'd noticed how thin her mother had gotten, though she'd attributed that to the drinking rather than lack of food. But she hadn't realized just how desperate their situation had become. "How much do we owe?" Elena asked quietly, dreading the answer. $3,000. The number hit Elena like a physical blow. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. It was more money than most people in Millfield saw in a lifetime. And that's just to the bank. I owe another $2,000 to some private lenders. Elena didn't need to ask what kind of private lenders her mother was referring to. Everyone in town knew about the gambling debts that had been piling up since Papa's death. Consuela had started with small bets, claiming it was just a way to forget her grief, but it had quickly spiraled out of control. "Mama, we can figure this out. I can get a job, maybe at the general store, or a job." Consuela's laugh was even more bitter this time. "You think some little job is going to bring in $5,000? You think stocking shelves is going to save us from the kind of men who break legs when they don't get their money?" Eleanor felt tears beginning to sting her eyes, but she fought them back. Crying only made her mother angrier, and right now, she needed to stay calm and try to find a solution. "There has to be something we can do. Maybe we could sell the house, move somewhere cheaper." "The house is already gone," Consuela said flatly. "Foreclosure notice came yesterday. We have 1 week to get out." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. This house, small and shabby as it was, represented everything that was left of their family. Papa had built it with his own hands when he and Mama had first gotten married. Elena had taken her first steps on these floors, had celebrated every birthday and holiday within. "These walls, where will we go?" Elena whispered. Consuela's expression shifted, and for a moment, Elena saw something that terrified her more than anger ever could: cold, calculated determination. "That's where you come in, mi amor," Consuela said, her voice taking on a sickly, sweet tone that made Elena's skin crawl. "You see, I've been thinking about our situation, and I realized we do have something valuable to offer." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The way her mother was looking at her, like she was appraising a piece of property rather than looking at her own daughter, made her want to run. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer and was desperately hoping she was wrong. "You're 16 now, Elena, a woman grown, and as I mentioned, there's been talk around town about how beautiful you've become." Consuela circled her daughter slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Beautiful enough that certain gentlemen have expressed interest." "No." The word escaped Elena's lips as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute horror. "Mama, no. You can't be thinking what I think you're thinking." "I'm thinking about survival," Consuela snapped, her mask of sweetness falling away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "I'm thinking about keeping us both alive long enough to see next month." Elena backed away from her mother, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This couldn't be happening. Her own mother, the woman who had sung her lullabies, who had bandaged her scraped knees, who had once loved her more than life itself, couldn't be contemplating selling her own daughter. "There's going to be an auction tomorrow," Consuela continued, her voice taking on a businesslike tone that was somehow even more terrifying than her anger. "Not an official one, you understand, but word gets around. There are men with money who are looking for companionship and willing to pay handsomely for it." "Mama, please!" Elena begged, tears now streaming down her face despite her efforts to hold them back. "I'm your daughter. Your own flesh and blood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. How can you even think about doing this to me? For just a moment, something flickered in Consuela's eyes. A shadow of the woman she used to be, the mother who had once protected Elena from everything bad in the world. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath layers of desperation, alcohol, and self-preservation. You think I want to do this? Consuela's voice cracked slightly. You think this is easy for me, but what choice do I have? If I don't pay what I owe by next week, they'll kill me. And what happens to you then? At least this way you'll be alive. You'll be fed, clothed, protected. Protected? Elena's voice rose to a near shriek. You call selling me to some stranger protection? Mama, please, think about what you're saying. Think about what Papa would say if he could see you now. The mention of her dead husband seemed to hit Consuela like a physical blow. Her face contorted with pain and rage, and for a moment Elena thought she might have gotten through to her, but then the moment passed and her mother's expression hardened once again. Your father is dead, Consuela said coldly. Dead and buried, and not here to help us with the mess he left behind. It's just you and me now, and I'm doing what I have to do to keep us both breathing. Elena felt something break inside her chest, not just her heart, but something deeper, more fundamental. The last vestiges of the child who had believed her mother would always protect her, always love her, always put her first. That child had died in that moment, replaced by a young woman who suddenly understood that she was completely, utterly alone in the world. I won't do it, Elena said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. I won't let you sell me. I'll run away first. Consuela's laugh was sharp and cruel. Run away? With what money? To where? You think there's anywhere in this territory you could go that I couldn't find you? That they couldn't find you? She was right, and Elena knew it. A 16-year-old girl alone in the Arizona territory wouldn't last a week. The desert would kill her if the outlaws didn't get to her first. But even knowing that, Elena couldn't bring herself to simply accept what her mother was planning. There has to be another way, Elena said desperately. We could go to the church, ask for help. Or maybe the sheriff. The sheriff owes money to the same people I do. Consuela cut her off, and the church doesn't have $5,000 lying around. Face it, Elena, this is our only option. Elena stared at her mother, this woman who had given birth to her, raised her, claimed to love her. She searched Consuela's face for any sign of the mother she remembered, any hint of the woman who had once been her whole world. But all she saw was a stranger. A desperate, broken stranger who was willing to sacrifice her own daughter to save herself. When? Elena asked, her voice hollow. Tomorrow, noon, at the old Richardson place outside town. Elena nodded slowly, feeling strangely detached from her own body, as if she were watching this conversation happen to someone else. Tomorrow. She had less than 24 hours before her mother would hand her over to whatever monster was willing to pay the highest price. That night, Elena lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to her mother's drunken snores from the next room. She had considered running, had even packed a small bag and made it as far as the front door before reality set in. Where would she go? How would she survive? And even if she somehow managed to escape, what would happen to her mother when the creditors came calling? As much as she wanted to hate Consuela, as much as she wanted to curse her and blame her for everything that had gone wrong, Elena couldn't bring herself to completely abandon the woman who had raised her. Maybe that made her weak. Maybe it made her stupid. But it was the truth. Instead, Elena found herself thinking about her father. Miguel Reyes had been a quiet man, a carpenter by trade, who had loved his family with a fierce, protective devotion. He had died in a construction accident, crushed by a falling beam while working on the new church that was being built on the other side of town. Elena had been only 13 at the time, old enough to understand that their lives would never be the same, but too young to realize just how completely her world was about to collapse. Miguel had left them a small insurance policy, enough to keep them going for a few months if they were careful. But Consuela hadn't been careful. She'd started drinking almost immediately after the funeral, claiming it was the only way she could sleep at night. And with the drinking had come the gambling. First at the cantina's weekly poker games, then at the more serious games run by the territory's less savory characters. Elena had watched helplessly as her mother spiraled deeper and deeper into addiction and debt. She tried to intervene, tried to get help, but no one wanted to get involved in what they saw as a family matter. And now, here they were, with Elena about to pay the ultimate price for her mother's failures. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Elena made a decision. She wouldn't run and she wouldn't fight. She would go to this auction and hope that whoever bought her would at least treat her with some measure of kindness. It wasn't much of a hope, but it was all she had left. The morning passed in a blur of preparations that felt more like funeral arrangements than anything else. Consuela insisted that Elena bathe and dress in her best clothes, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother in better times. She braided Elena's long, dark hair and even applied a small amount of rouge to her cheeks, all the while maintaining a businesslike demeanor that made Elena feel like a piece of livestock being prepared for market. As they walked toward the old Richardson Place, an abandoned homestead about a mile outside of town, Elena found herself taking in every detail of the landscape around her. The way the morning light caught the red rocks in the distance, the sound of a hawk calling from somewhere high above, the sweet scent of desert flowers blooming despite the harsh conditions. She wanted to remember everything about this moment, this last moment of her old life before whatever came next began. The Richardson place had been abandoned for nearly a decade, ever since old Tom Richardson had died and his children had moved back east. The house was little more than a shell now, its windows broken and its roof partially collapsed. But it was isolated and private, making it the perfect location for the kind of business that needed to be conducted away from prying eyes. As they approached the property, Elena could see that they weren't alone. Several horses were tethered near what remained of the old barn, and she could make out the figures of men gathered in the shade of the building. Her mother squeezed her arm. Whether in reassurance or warning, Elena couldn't tell. "Remember," Consuela whispered as they drew closer, "be polite, be respectful. The better impression you make, the better price you'll fetch, and the better your situation will be." Elena wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Her own mother giving her advice on how to be more appealing to potential buyers. But the sound that escaped her throat was more of a choked sob than laughter. The men gathered at the Richardson place were exactly what Elena had expected, rough, weathered individuals who looked like they'd spent more time in saloons than in church. There were about a dozen of them, ranging in age from their 30s to their 60s, all dressed in the kind of clothes that spoke of hard living and questionable morals. They looked at Elena with the appraising gazes of men evaluating livestock, and she felt her skin crawl under their scrutiny. One man in particular caught her attention, not because he was looking at her like the others, but because he wasn't. He stood apart from the group, leaning against the remains of a fence post, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. Something about his stillness, his separateness from the others, made Elena's breath catch in her throat. There was something different about him, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. "Gentlemen," called out a man Elena recognized as Jake Morley, one of the territory's most notorious gamblers and the man to whom her mother owed the largest portion of her debt. "I believe we're ready to begin." And so, as the desert sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, Elena Reyes found herself standing on what amounted to an auction block, her own mother preparing to sell her to the highest bidder. But none of them, Not Elena, not Consuela, not even the mysterious man standing apart from the crowd could have predicted what was about to happen next. Jake Morley stepped forward with the swagger of a man who controlled more lives than he could count. His expensive boots kicked up small clouds of dust as he positioned himself between Eleanor and the gathered crowd of potential buyers. The gold tooth that gleamed when he smiled caught the harsh Arizona sun, creating an almost demonic glint that made Elena's stomach turn. "Now then, gentlemen," Morley announced, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to conducting such vile business. "We have here a prime specimen, 16 years old, healthy as a horse, and as you can see, quite easy on the eyes." Elena felt her cheeks burn with shame as the men's gazes swept over her like hungry wolves sizing up their prey. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to bear the sight of their leering faces. But even with her gaze downcast, she could feel their assessment of her body, their mental calculations of what she might be worth to them. "The girl comes with no diseases, no complications," Morley continued, circling Elena like a carnival barker showing off his latest attraction. "She's been raised proper by her mama here, knows how to cook, clean, and keep house. And I can personally vouch that she's got spirit. Not so broken that she'll be boring, but not so wild that she'll cause problems." Consuela stood off to the side, clutching her whiskey bottle like a lifeline. For brief moments, Elena caught glimpses of internal conflict flickering across her mother's face, shadows of the woman who had once protected her daughter from scraped knees and childhood nightmares. But those shadows were quickly buried beneath layers of desperation and alcohol-fueled numbness. "Let's start the bidding at $50, Morley called out. "50, came a voice from the crowd immediately. Elena recognized it as belonging to Warren Hutchins, the owner of the territory's largest cattle operation and a man known for his cruel treatment of both animals and workers. 75, called another voice, this one belonging to Samuel Ridge, who ran a saloon 3 towns over and had a reputation for keeping girls locked in back rooms for the entertainment of his customers. Elena felt her world spinning as the numbers climbed higher. Each bid represented a different nightmare, a different form of hell that awaited her. She tried to focus on breathing, on staying upright, on maintaining some shred of dignity in the face of this ultimate humiliation. But it was the silence that truly terrified her. Throughout the increasingly frenzied bidding, one voice had remained conspicuously absent. That of the mysterious man who continued to stand apart from the crowd. Elena found herself stealing glances at him, trying to understand why he was there if not to participate. His stillness was unnerving, like a predator waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. The man was tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent under the desert sun. His clothes were simple but well made. Leather chaps, overworn denim pants, a cotton shirt that had seen better days but was clean and mended, and boots that looked like they'd walked thousands of miles across unforgiving terrain. But it was his face that captured Elena's attention. Angular features that suggested Native American heritage, dark eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing, and an expression of absolute calm that stood in stark contrast to the excitement and greed radiating from the other men. $125, Hutchins called out, his voice growing more aggressive as the competition intensified. 150, Ridge countered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the early morning hour. Elena watched her mother throughout this grotesque auction, searching for any sign that Consuela might change her mind, might remember that she was selling her own flesh and blood. But all she saw was a woman calculating numbers, mentally spending money that hadn't even changed hands yet. The transformation was complete. The mother Eleanor had once known was truly gone, replaced by this hollow shell, driven by nothing more than survival instinct and addiction. As the bidding continued to escalate, Eleanor began to notice something strange happening with the mysterious man by the fence. While he hadn't spoken a word or made any gesture to indicate his participation in the auction, his attention seemed entirely focused not on Elena herself, but on the other bidders. He was studying them with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey, his dark eyes moving from face to face as if memorizing every detail. $200! Came a new voice from the back of the crowd. Elena's blood ran cold as she recognized the speaker, Marcus Blade, a man whose very name was whispered in fear throughout the territory. Blade was known to buy women and girls from desperate families, only to transport them to the mining camps and railroad towns where they disappeared, forever into lives of unspeakable horror. The crowd fell silent at Blade's bid. $200 was more money than most of the men present would see in 6 months, and they all knew Blade's reputation for getting what he wanted, one way or another. Even Hutchins and Ridge, who had been bidding aggressively just moments before, now seemed to shrink back into the crowd. 200 going once, Morley called out, though his voice lacked its earlier enthusiasm. Even he seemed uncomfortable with the prospect of turning Eleanor over to Marcus Blade. Elena felt her knees begin to buckle. She had heard the stories about Blade's operations, whispered tales of girls who went with him and were never seen again. This was worse than her worst nightmares. At least with Hutchins or Ridge, she might have had some chance of survival, some possibility of eventual escape. But with Blade, she would simply vanish, becoming just another forgotten victim in his network of human trafficking. A 200 going twice, Morley continued, his gavel raised and ready to fall, and then cutting through the desert air like a knife through silk, came a voice that changed everything. $500. The words were spoken quietly, without drama or flourish, but they hit the gathered crowd like a thunderbolt. Every head turned toward the source of the voice, the mysterious man by the fence who had remained silent throughout the entire proceedings. He stepped forward now, moving with a fluid grace that reminded Elena of the big cats she had occasionally glimpsed in the desert rocks. As he emerged from the shadows, she could see him more clearly, and what she saw both fascinated and terrified her. This was not like the other men. There was no greed in his eyes, no lustful hunger in his expression. Instead, there was something she couldn't quite identify, something that looked almost like sadness. 500, Morley repeated, his voice cracking slightly with surprise. That's quite a substantial offer, Mr. Torres, the man replied simply. Miguel Torres. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. Torres, a Spanish name, but the man's features suggested Native American ancestry. In the complex racial dynamics of the Arizona Territory, such mixed heritage often made a person an outcast in multiple communities, belonging fully to none. Marcus Blade pushed forward through the crowd, his face twisted with anger. Now hold on just a minute, he snarled. What's some half-breed doing at a white man's auction? The temperature of the gathering seemed to drop 10 degrees as Torres turned his attention to Blade. When he spoke, his voice remained calm and level, but there was something underneath it, something dangerous that made even Blade take an involuntary step backward. My money spends the same as yours, Torres said quietly, and I have more of it. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked heavily with the sound of silver coins. The sight of so much money had an immediate effect on the crowd. Greed overcame prejudice as the men realized they were looking at more wealth than most of them had ever seen in one place. Where does a man like you get that kind of money? Hutchins demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Torres's smile was thin and humorless. Same place men like you get yours. I just work harder for it. Elena found herself studying this man who had just bid an extraordinary sum for her. Unlike the others, he didn't look at her like she was property to be evaluated. When their eyes met briefly, she saw something unexpected: respect. It was such a foreign concept in her current situation that she almost didn't recognize it. "Well," Morley said, clearly eager to close the deal before anyone could cause trouble. $500 is a generous offer indeed. Anyone care to go higher? Blade looked like he wanted to continue bidding, but even he seemed to realize that $500 was beyond his reach. The other men shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of their financial depth. The silence stretched out, broken only by the whisper of wind through the abandoned buildings and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "500 going once," Morley called. Elena felt time slow down as she realized that her fate was about to be decided. In a few seconds, she would belong to this mysterious stranger who had appeared like a specter from the edges of the crowd. She knew nothing about him except his name and the fact that he had more money than anyone expected. Was she trading one nightmare for another, or had some miracle just occurred? 500 going twice. Consuela stepped forward suddenly, as if shaking off a trance. For a moment, Elena thought her mother might be having second thoughts, might be about to call off this horrible transaction, but instead, Consuela looked directly at Torres with an expression of desperate gratitude. "Mr. Torres," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you're getting a good girl. She's been raised. Right, I swear to you, she'll serve you well." The words hit Elena like physical blows. Even now, even in what might be her final moments as her mother's daughter, Consuela was thinking only of the transaction, only of ensuring that the buyer felt satisfied with his purchase. Torres nodded slowly at Consuela, but when he spoke, his words were directed at Elena herself. Another shocking breach of protocol that set this interaction apart from a typical slave auction. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Elena was so surprised by the direct question that she almost forgot to answer. "Elena," she managed to whisper. "Elena Reyes." "Elena Reyes," Torres repeated as if testing how the name sounded. "That's a good name, a strong name." Before Elena could respond, Morley brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the desert landscape. "Sold to Miguel Torres for $500. The sound of that gavel falling marked the end of Elena's old life and the beginning of something entirely unknown. As Torres approached to complete the transaction, counting out silver coins with methodical precision, Elena found herself studying his face for any clue about what lay ahead. What she saw puzzled her. This was not the expression of a man who had just purchased a piece of property for his personal use. Instead, there was something almost ceremonial about his demeanor, as if this moment held significance that went far beyond a simple business transaction. As the money changed hands, and the crowd began to disperse, Torres turned to Elena with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Are you ready?" he asked simply. Elena looked back at her mother one last time, hoping against hope for some sign of regret, some indication that Consuela might still remember that she had once loved her daughter. But all she saw was a woman clutching silver coins and already calculating how to spend them. "I'm ready," Elena said quietly, though she had no idea what she was ready for. As they walked toward Torres's horse, a magnificent black stallion that seemed as mysterious as its owner, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this man was different from the others in ways she didn't yet understand. The question was whether that difference would prove to be her salvation, or simply a different kind of doom. The ride away from the Richardson place passed in complete silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the black stallion's hooves against the hard-packed desert earth. Elena sat behind Miguel Torres on the horse, her hands gripping the saddle rather than touching him directly. unsure of what was expected of her in this strange new dynamic. Every few minutes, she would steal glances at the landscape around them, trying to memorize landmarks in case she needed to find her way back. Though back to what she couldn't say. Torres guided the horse not toward Millfield, as Elena had expected, but deeper into the desert, following paths that seemed invisible to her untrained eye. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they traveled, with towering red rock formations creating natural corridors and hidden valleys that stretched out endlessly under the blazing Arizona sun. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being taken somewhere from which there might be no return. After what felt like hours of riding, Torres finally spoke, his voice barely audible over the wind and the sound of the horse's movement. "Are you thirsty?" The question was so mundane, so considerate, that Elena was momentarily taken aback. In all her imaginings of what this journey might entail, simple human kindness had not featured prominently. "Yes," she admitted quietly. Without another word, Torres guided the stallion toward a small cluster of rocks that provided a patch of shade. He dismounted with fluid grace, then turned to help Elena down, but he didn't grab her or manhandle her as she had expected. Instead, he simply offered his hand and waited for her to decide whether to accept his assistance. Elena hesitated for a moment, studying his face for any sign of deception or hidden motive. But all she saw was patience and what appeared to be genuine concern for her comfort. Cautiously, she took his hand and allowed him to help her down from the horse. Torres produced a water skin from his saddlebags and offered it to her without drinking first himself, another small gesture that spoke to a consideration she hadn't expected. The water was cool and clean, tasting better than anything she could remember drinking in recent weeks. As she drank, Torres moved to check the horse's hooves and adjust the saddle, giving her a few moments of privacy to collect herself. "Where are you taking me?" Elena asked when she had drunk her fill. Torres looked up from examining the horse's front left hoof, his dark eyes unreadable in the shadow cast by his hat brim. "Somewhere safe," he said simply. "Safe from what?" "From men like the ones back there, from people who would use you and throw you away when they were done." Elena felt a chill run down her spine, despite the desert heat. "And what about you? What do you plan to do with me?" Torres straightened and looked at her directly, and Elena was surprised to see something that looked almost like pain flash across his features. "That depends," he said quietly. "On what? On what you want to do." The answer was so unexpected that Elena wasn't sure she had heard correctly. In her 16 years of life, no one had ever asked her what she wanted to do about anything of importance. Decisions had always been made for her, by her parents, by circumstances, by the cruel mathematics of poverty and desperation. "I don't understand," she said. Torres seemed to consider his words carefully before responding. "The money I paid for you, it wasn't to buy you. It was to free you. But freedom isn't something that can be given. It has to be chosen." Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Was this some kind of elaborate trick, a game designed to make her lower her guard before revealing his true intentions? "Why would you pay $500 just to free me?" she asked suspiciously. "You don't even know me." Torres was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the desert horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that Elena could feel even without understanding its source. "Because 15 years ago, someone should have done the same thing for my sister." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Elena felt her breath catch as she began to understand that this man's motivations ran far deeper than she had imagined. "What happened to your sister?" she asked softly. Torres's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment Elena thought he might not answer. But then he began to speak, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled emotion. Her name was Isabella. She was 14 when our parents died of fever. I was only 16 myself, working as a hand, on the ranch 50 miles from our village, trying to earn enough money to bring her to live with me. Torres paused, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. But before I could save enough, the debt collectors came for our family's land. Isabella had no way to pay what our father owed. Eleanor felt her stomach drop as she realized where this story was heading. They took her, sold her, Torres said flatly, just like your mother was about to sell you. I got word 3 days later, rode back as fast as I could, but by then she was gone, taken by traders who specialized in moving young girls to the mining camps in California. Did you find her? Torres's silence was answer enough. Elena watched as he struggled with memories that were clearly still raw, despite the passage of 15 years. I spent 2 years searching, he finally continued, followed every lead, tracked down every rumor, spent every dollar I had and borrowed more. Finally found the camp where she'd been taken. His voice grew even quieter. Found her grave too. She'd been dead for 6 months. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes as she began to understand the full weight of what Torres had done for her. This wasn't charity or kindness born of abstract moral principles. This was a man trying to save a sister. He had lost 15 years too late. I'm sorry, she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but not knowing what else to say. Torres nodded slightly, acknowledging her sympathy while clearly struggling to maintain his composure. After Isabella died, I made myself a promise, he said. If I ever had the chance to prevent another girl from suffering the same fate, I would take it, no matter what it cost. But $500, Eleanor began, is nothing compared to a life, Torres finished. I've spent the last 15 years building a ranch, saving every penny I could, waiting for this opportunity. When I heard about the auction, I knew it was time. Elena studied this man who had just revealed so much of himself to a complete stranger. There was something almost sacred about the moment, as if she were witnessing a ritual of redemption that had been 15 years in the making. What happens now? She asked. Now you choose, Torres said. You can come with me to my ranch. You'll have your own room, your own space. You can work if you want to. I can always use help with the horses and cattle, but you'll be paid. Fair wages for fair work. Or if you prefer, I can take you to the mission in Tucson. The sisters there will help you start a new life somewhere far from here. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the sudden abundance of choices. For so long, her life had been a series of reactions to circumstances beyond her control. The idea that she could actually decide her own fate felt almost too large to comprehend. And if I choose to stay at your ranch, she said carefully, what would you expect from me? Torres looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Expect from you? Nothing that you don't choose to give. You would be a guest in my home, not a servant or... He paused, seeming to understand the direction of her thoughts. Eleanor, I need you to understand something very clearly. I did not buy you to be my wife or my woman or anything else that men like Hutchins or Blade might have wanted. I bought you to give you back your freedom. But surely you must want something. In return, Elena pressed. Men don't spend that kind of money without expecting something back. Torres was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I want to sleep at night without seeing Isabella's face. I want to stop wondering if things might have been different, if I had been faster, smarter, braver. I want to believe that her death might mean something if it prevents yours. The raw honesty in his voice hit Elena like a physical blow. She realized that in some ways this man was as much a prisoner of his past as she had been of her circumstances. The $500 he had paid wasn't just the price of her freedom, it was the price of his own redemption. Where is your Ranch? She asked. 2 days' ride north of here in a valley between the Superstition Mountains. It's isolated, but it's beautiful. There's a stream that runs year-round, good grass for the cattle, and enough space that you could ride for hours without seeing another soul. Eleanor tried to imagine such a place. Vast, open spaces where she could breathe freely, where no one would look at her with hungry eyes or calculating minds. It sounded like paradise, but she had learned to be wary of things that seemed too good to be true. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked. "How do I know this isn't all just a different kind of trap?" Torres considered the question seriously, as if it were perfectly reasonable, which, Elena realized, it was. "You don't," he said finally. "You have no reason to trust me, and every reason to be suspicious. All I can offer you is my word, and I understand that the word of a stranger doesn't carry much weight." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made Elena's breath catch, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. "This belonged to Isabella," he said, holding it out for Elena to see. "It has her picture inside, and a lock of her hair. It's the only thing I have left of her, and the most precious thing I own." Elena looked at the locket, seeing how carefully he held it, how his thumb traced over its worn surface with the kind of tenderness reserved for sacred objects. "I want you to have it," Torres said, extending his hand toward her. "I can't take that," Eleanor protested. "It belongs to your sister." "My sister is dead," Torres said quietly. "But maybe her memory can live on in helping you build a new life. She would have wanted that." Elena stared at the locket, understanding that this was more than just a gesture of trust. It was a passing of responsibility, a torch being handed from one generation to the next. If she accepted it, she would be accepting not just Torres's help, but also the weight of Isabella's memory and the obligation to make something meaningful of the freedom she was being offered. Slowly, carefully, Elena reached out and took the locket from Torres's hand. The silver was warm from his touch and surprisingly heavy for such a small object. As her fingers closed around it, she felt something shift inside her. Not just gratitude or relief, but something deeper and more complex. Purpose, perhaps, or hope. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried weight far beyond their simple syllables. Torres nodded, and Elena saw something ease in his expression, as if a burden he had been carrying for 15 years had finally begun. "Delightful. So," he said, "what do you choose, the ranch or the mission in Tucson?" Elena looked around at the vast desert landscape stretching out in every direction, then back at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to make. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. "I choose the ranch," she said firmly. "I choose to trust you." Torres smiled then, the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him, and she realized that her decision had freed something in him as well as in herself. "Then let's go home," he said simply, as they prepared to remount the black stallion and continue their journey into the unknown. Elena clutched Isabella's locket tightly in her hand. She was no longer just Elena Reyes, the girl whose mother had sold her to pay gambling debts. She was Elena Reyes, the girl who had been given a second chance at life, and she was determined to make the most of it. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but also full of possibility. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena looked toward the horizon, not with fear, but with anticipation for what lay ahead. 3 days after the auction, Marcus Blade sat in the back room of Rosa's cantina, his scarred fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against the wooden table. The room reeked of stale tobacco and spilled whiskey, but Blade barely noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the $500 that had slipped through his fingers, and more importantly, the girl who had come with it. Across from him sat Deputy Sheriff Coleman Walsh, a man whose badge had long since become nothing more than decoration, covering a heart as corrupt as the desert was dry. Walsh nervously sipped his whiskey, well aware that disappointing Marcus Blade was a dangerous proposition. "Tell me again what you found out about this Miguel Torres," Blade growled, his voice carrying the menace of a rattlesnake's warning. Walsh consulted the crumpled notes in his sweaty palm. "Not much to go on. No official records in any of the territory offices, but I talked to some of the older hands at the cattle ranches, and they remember him. Worked as a vaquero for about 10 years, saved every penny, then disappeared about 5 years ago. Disappeared where? North, into the Superstition Mountains. Rumor has it he built himself a spread up there, but nobody knows exactly where. That country's rough, lots of canyons and hidden valleys where a man could hide if he wanted to stay hidden." Blade's eyes narrowed. The Superstition Mountains were known to be treacherous terrain, full of Apache war parties and claim jumpers who shot first and asked questions later. It was the perfect place for someone to disappear, permanently. What about his background? Where'd he come from originally? Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "That's where it gets interesting. Some folks say he's got Apache blood, others claim Mexican. Could be both or neither. But here's the thing that might matter to you. Word is he's got money, real money. Not just what he paid for the girl, but serious wealth." Blade leaned forward, his interest piqued. In his line of work, money always mattered more than anything else. Women, territory, even revenge. Money was the one currency that never lost its value. How? Much money? Enough to pay 500 in silver without blinking. Enough to build a ranch in country where most men couldn't afford to survive. I'm thinking maybe enough to make it worth our while to pay him a visit. As Walsh spoke, neither man noticed the small figure crouched outside the cantina's back window. Rosa's youngest daughter, Carmen, only 12 years old, but already wise to the ways of dangerous men, had been eavesdropping on conversations in her mother's establishment since she was old enough to understand that information was power. Carmen had seen Elena Reyes grow up, had watched the beautiful girl's life crumble as her mother descended into drunkenness and desperation. When she'd heard about the auction, her heart had broken for Elena. But when she'd seen Miguel Torres ride away with the girl, something in his bearing had given her hope that maybe, just maybe, Elena had found salvation rather than another form of damnation. Now, listening to Blade and Walsh plan their hunt, Carmen realized that Eleanor's freedom might be even more fragile than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, 2 days' ride north in the hidden valley Torres called home, Elena was experiencing something she had never known in her 16 years of life. Peace. The ranch was everything Torres had promised and more. The main house was modest, but beautifully crafted, built from local stone and timber in a style that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape itself. A clear stream ran through the property, providing fresh water year-round and supporting cottonwood trees that offered blessed shade from the relentless desert sun. Elena had been given her own room, the first private space she had ever possessed, with a real bed, clean linens, and a window that looked out over rolling pasture land where Torres's cattle grazed peacefully. The room even had books, something Elena had rarely encountered in her impoverished upbringing. Torres had noticed her fascination with the written word and had quietly stocked the shelves with volumes of poetry, adventure stories, and even some basic texts on mathematics and natural science. But it was the work that truly set Elena free. Torres had been true to his word about offering her employment rather than expecting unpaid servitude. Each morning, he would ask if she wanted to help with the day's tasks, and each morning she found herself eager to contribute. She discovered that she had a natural affinity for working with the horses, and Torres proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to read the animals' moods, how to approach them with confidence but not aggression, how to earn their trust. Through consistency and kindness, horses are like people, Torres had told her on her third day at the ranch as they worked together to gentle a young stallion that had been running wild in the mountains. They can sense fear, but they can also sense authenticity. Be yourself with them, and they'll be themselves with you. Elena had taken those words to heart, and to her amazement, the horses seemed to respond to her in ways that surprised even Torres. The wild stallion, which had been skittish and aggressive with everyone else, allowed Elena to approach and eventually to place a halter on his head. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental to a girl who had spent her life being told she was worthless. As the days passed, Elena began to understand that Torres was offering her something far more valuable than just freedom from her mother's debts. He was offering her the chance to discover who she really was when she wasn't defined by other people's expectations or limitations. For the first time in her life, she was being treated as a person with her own thoughts, feelings, and capabilities. But even paradise has its shadows, and Elena's peace was about to be shattered. It was Carmen who brought the warning, riding hard through the desert night on her mother's old mule, guided by moonlight and desperation. She had slipped away from the cantina after her mother fell asleep, knowing that she might be Eleanor's only hope of avoiding recapture. Torres was checking on the cattle in the pre-dawn darkness when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. His hand went instinctively to the rifle he always carried, but he relaxed slightly when he recognized the small figure on the mule as a child rather than a threat. Still, children didn't ride alone through the desert at night, unless something was seriously wrong. "Help me!" Carmen gasped as she slid down from the mule, her small body shaking with exhaustion and fear. "They're coming for Elena, Blade and the deputy. They know where you live." Torres felt ice form in his veins, despite the warm desert air. Marcus Blade was a name that carried weight throughout the territory, and none of that weight was good. If Blade was coming for Elena, it meant the nightmare Torres thought he had ended was just beginning. "How do you know this?" Torres asked, helping Carmen toward the house. "I heard them talking at Mama's cantina. They're planning to take her back, and they're planning to take your money too. They'll be here by tomorrow night, maybe sooner." Torres's mind raced as he processed this information. Blade wouldn't come alone, and he wouldn't come unprepared. The man had a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of the cost in blood or suffering. More importantly, Blade had the law on his side in the form of Deputy Walsh, which meant that any resistance Torres offered could be painted as criminal activity. Elena appeared in the doorway of the house, drawn by the sound of voices. When she saw Carmen, her face went pale. "What's wrong?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. Torres looked at Elena, this young woman who had just begun to discover her own strength and potential, and felt the familiar rage that had sustained him through 15 years of searching for his sister's killers. History was threatening to repeat itself, but this time he had the chance to change the ending. "Pack only what you can carry," he told Elena quietly. "We're leaving. Now." "Where are we going?" "Deeper into the mountains. There are places up there where even Blade won't be able to follow." But Elena surprised him by shaking her head. "No, I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being treated like property that can be stolen or traded or sold. If they want me, let them come. I'll face them here." Torres stared at her, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him powerfully of Isabella, a fierce pride that refused to be broken no matter what the world threw at it. But he also saw something Isabella had never had the chance to develop. The strength that came from being valued and respected, from knowing that she had worth beyond what others might want to take from her. Elena, you don't understand what kind of man Blade is. He won't just take you back to your mother, I know exactly what kind of man he is," Elena interrupted. "I've known men like him my whole life, but I also know something they don't. Expect? I know what it feels like to be free, and I'm not giving that up without a fight." Torres felt something shift inside his chest, a mixture of admiration and terror that threatened to overwhelm him. Elena was no longer the frightened girl he had rescued from the auction block. In just a few days of freedom, she had begun to transform into someone entirely different, someone who refused to be a victim, someone who would stand and fight for what was hers. "Then we fight," Torres said simply. "But we fight smart." As the sun rose over the hidden valley, Torres began preparing for a battle that would determine not just Elena's fate, but the fate of everything he had built in his years of self-imposed exile. He cleaned and loaded every weapon he owned, checked the security of the ranch buildings, and began laying traps along the most likely approach routes. Carmen proved to be invaluable in these preparations. Despite her youth, she knew the territory well and had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence. She helped Torres identify the best defensive positions and suggested ways to use the natural landscape to their advantage. "There's an old mine shaft about a mile up the canyon," she told them as they studied a hand-drawn map of the area. "If things go bad, Elena could hide there while you deal with Blade and his men." Elena shook her head firmly. "I told you, I'm not hiding anymore. If we're going to fight, we fight together." "Elena, you don't know how to use a gun," Torres pointed out gently. "Then teach me." The next few hours passed in intensive training as Torres showed Elena the basics of handling a rifle. She proved to be a quick learner, her natural coordination serving her well as she practiced loading, aiming and firing at targets Torres set up around the ranch. She wasn't going to become an expert marksman overnight, but she could at least defend herself if necessary. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Torres found himself studying Elena's face as she concentrated on her shooting practice. The transformation was remarkable. This was no longer the broken, defeated girl he had rescued. This was a young woman who had discovered her own power and was prepared to use it. But even as he admired her courage, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that they were preparing for a battle they might not survive. Blade was ruthless, experienced, and would have numerical superiority. Worse, he had the law on his side, which meant that even if they managed to fight him off, Torres and Elena would become fugitives. As darkness began to fall over the valley, Torres made a decision that went against every instinct he possessed. Instead of waiting for Blade to come to them, he would go to Blade. It was a desperate gambit, but it might be their only chance to end this confrontation on their own terms. "I want you to stay here with Carmen," he told Elena as he prepared to leave. "If I'm not back by dawn, take the horses and head for the Mexican border." Elena grabbed his arm, her eyes blazing with determination. "You're not going alone. We're in this together, remember?" Torres looked into her eyes and saw not just courage, but something else. Trust. Elena trusted him completely, was willing to follow him into danger because she believed in him. It was a responsibility that both humbled and terrified him. "Together," he agreed quietly, as they prepared to ride out into the darkness to face Marcus Blade. Neither Torres nor Elena could have predicted that the confrontation ahead would not only determine their own fates, but would also reveal secrets about Torres's past that would change everything Elena thought she knew about the man who had saved her life. The hunt was about to begin, and before it was over, blood would be spilled under the desert stars. Chart Confrontation came not at Torres's ranch as expected, but on the wind-swept mesa overlooking the valley, where the old Apache burial ground stretched out under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. Elena had insisted they meet Blade's party on neutral ground, away from the home Torres had built with his own hands, away from the sanctuary that had given her the first taste of freedom she had ever known. It was a decision that would prove to be the most important of her life. Marcus Blade arrived with 5 men, their faces hard and their weapons visible. But Elena noticed something Torres had trained her to see. They were nervous. Men who made their living preying on the desperate and defenseless were not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by their intended victims. The fact that Elena and Torres had chosen to meet them in the open rather than cowering in a hiding had already shifted the balance of power in ways Blade clearly hadn't anticipated. Deputy Walsh rode slightly behind Blade, his badge catching the moonlight like a tarnished star. Even from a distance, Elena could see the sweat staining his shirt despite the cool desert night. Whatever authority his position gave him, it clearly didn't extend to feeling comfortable in the presence of the man he was supposed to be helping. Well, Blade called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying across the mesa with practiced intimidation. Miguel Torres, I've been looking forward to meeting the man who thinks he can interfere with my business. Torres remained mounted, his rifle resting across his saddle horn, his posture relaxed but ready. Elena sat her horse beside him, and she could feel the coiled tension in his body like a spring wound, tight and ready to snap. Your business, Torres replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, seems to involve buying and selling. Human beings, that's not business, that's slavery. Blade laughed, a sound like grinding stone that held no humor whatsoever. Slavery? That's a harsh word, friend. I prefer to think of it as providing opportunities for young ladies who find themselves in difficult circumstances. Opportunities, Elena said, speaking for the first time since they had ridden out to meet. Blade's party. Her voice was steady, clear, and carried a strength that surprised even her. Is that what you call locking girls in mining camps until they die of disease and despair? Blade's expression darkened as he turned his attention to Elena. The girl speaks. How unexpected. Most of the merchandise I acquire knows better than to open their mouths unless asked. I'm not merchandise, Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm not property to be bought and sold. I'm a human being. And I choose my own fate. Choose? Blade's laugh was uglier this time. Little girl, you don't get to choose anything. Your mother sold you fair and square, and this half-breed paid good money for you, but that transaction was completed under false pretenses. You see, I had already made arrangements with your mother to acquire you for my organization. Torres here interfered with a pre-existing business arrangement. Torres straightened in his saddle, his dark eyes fixed on Blade with laser intensity. What arrangements? Deputy Walsh pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his vest pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded it. This here's a contract signed by Consuela Reyes 3 days before the auction. She agreed to sell her daughter to Mr. Blade's organization for $200, paid in advance. Elena felt the world tilt beneath her as the implications sank in. Her mother hadn't just decided to sell her at the auction. She had already sold her days earlier, then allowed the auction to proceed anyway, essentially selling her twice. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Eleanor had experienced. A wound that went beyond simple abandonment into the realm of calculated cruelty. That's fraud, Torres said flatly. She can't sell what she's already sold. Exactly, Blade said, his confidence returning now that he felt he had the legal advantage. Which means your purchase was invalid. The girl belongs to me, and I'm here to collect what's rightfully mine. Eleanor felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. as she looked at the men surrounding them. These weren't just criminals. They were criminals who had found a way to make their activities appear legal, at least on paper. The system that was supposed to protect people like her had been corrupted into a tool for their exploitation. But instead of feeling defeated, Elena felt something else rising within her, a rage so pure and focused that it seemed to burn away everything else. She had been betrayed by her mother, hunted by men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity, and now they expected her to simply submit because they had the right paperwork. "No," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the mesa with startling clarity. Blade blinked, clearly not having expected such a direct refusal. "Excuse me?" I said no. "I don't care what contracts you have or what my mother signed. I choose to be free, and I choose to stay with Torres. You don't get to choose, girl. Your property—" "I'm not property." Eleanor's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the canyon walls. "I am Elena Reyes, and I am a free woman, and I will die before I let you or anyone else treat me like something to be owned." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena felt something fundamental shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. This was no longer about legal technicalities or business arrangements. This had become a battle for the soul of human dignity itself. Blade's hand moved toward his gun, but before he could draw, Torres's rifle was pointed directly at his chest. "I wouldn't," Torres said quietly, his voice carrying a deadly certainty that made even Blade pause. "You're outnumbered 6-2, Walsh said, finally finding his voice, "and you're threatening a deputy sheriff. That's a hanging offense." "Is it?" Torres asked, his eyes never leaving Blade's face. "Or is it self-defense against kidnappers and slavers? We have legal documents. You have pieces of paper signed by a drunken woman who didn't have the right to sign them in the first place." Torres interrupted. "Elena is 16 years old. By territorial law, she has the right to refuse any contract made on her behalf by her parents if she can demonstrate that she's capable of making her own decisions." Elena stared at Torres in amazement. She had never heard of such a law, but the certainty in his voice suggested he knew exactly what he was talking about. Blade's expression had grown increasingly ugly as the conversation continued. "Laws are for people who can afford lawyers, half-breed, and lawyers are for people who live long enough to hire them." The threat was clear, and Elena felt Torres tense beside her. But before anyone could draw a weapon, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "That's enough. Everyone." Turned toward the source of the voice, and Elena felt her breath catch. Standing at the edge of the mesa, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, was a figure she had never expected to see again. Her father. Miguel Reyes stepped into the circle of light cast by the moon, and Elena felt her world shift once more. But this wasn't the Miguel Reyes who had died in a construction accident 3 years ago. This was a man who carried himself with the bearing of a warrior, whose eyes held depths of knowledge and pain that Elena had never seen before. "Papa," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. The man who had called himself Miguel Torres turned toward her, and for the first time since she had known him, Elena saw his face completely unguarded. There was love there, and pain, and a desperate hope that took her breath away. "Hello, Misha," he said softly. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." Elena felt tears streaming down her face as the full truth hit her like a physical blow. The man who had saved her from the auction, who had given her freedom and dignity and hope, was not a stranger moved by memories of his dead sister. He was her father, alive and searching for her for 3 years, finally finding her at the moment when she needed him most. "But Isabella, your sister?" Elena stammered. "Isabella was your mother's name before she married me," Miguel said gently. "She died when you were born. I've been carrying her picture all these years, waiting for the day I could give it to you." The locket Elena wore around her neck suddenly felt warm against her skin as she understood its true significance. It wasn't the memorial to a lost sister. It was a gift from her father to the daughter he had never stopped trying to find. "You let me believe you were dead," Elena said, her voice mixing anger and relief in equal measure. "I had to," Miguel replied. "After the accident, men came looking for me, said I owed debts that weren't mine. I realized they were using me to get to you and your mother. So I disappeared, changed my name, built a new life. But I never stopped, watching over you. I never stopped trying to find a way to bring you home." Blade had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience and rage. "This is all very touching," he snarled, "but it doesn't change anything. I have legal claim to the girl, and I'm taking her." Miguel turned toward Blade, and Elena saw something in her father's eyes that made her blood run cold. This was not the gentle man who had patiently taught her to work with horses. This was someone far more dangerous, someone who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment. "You're not taking her anywhere," Miguel said, his voice carrying absolute finality. "We'll see about that," Blade replied, his hand moving toward his gun. What happened next occurred so quickly that Elena barely had time to process it. Blade's gun was halfway out of its holster when Miguel's rifle cracked like thunder. Blade spun around and fell, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain and rage. The other men reached for their weapons, but they found themselves facing not just Miguel and Elena, but a semicircle of armed figures who had emerged from the rocks around the mesa like spirits materializing from the desert itself. "I wouldn't move if I were you," came a voice from the darkness, and Elena recognized it as belonging to Sheriff Tom Harrison from the county seat, a man whose reputation for honesty was as well known as Blade's reputation for corruption. "Sheriff Harrison," Deputy Walsh stammered, "what are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mess," Harrison replied, stepping into the light. "We've been watching Blade's operation for months, waiting for him to make a mistake big enough to shut him down permanently. Kidnapping and attempted murder ought to do it." Eleanor watched in amazement as Harrison's men systematically disarmed and arrested Blade's party. The deputy's badge was stripped from Walsh's vest, and he was handcuffed along with the others. "How did you know to come here?" Elena asked Sheriff Harrison. "Your friend Carmen rode to the county seat and told us what was happening," Harrison replied. "Smart girl. She probably saved your lives." As the prisoners were being prepared for transport, Eleanor found herself alone with her father for the first time in 3 years. There were so many questions she wanted to ask, so many things she needed to understand, but only one thing seemed to matter in that moment. "Are you really my father?" she asked quietly. Miguel, she would always think of him as Miguel now, not Torres, reached out and gently touched her face. "I am your father, and you are my daughter, and I have loved you every moment of every day since the day you were born." Eleanor threw her arms around him, holding him with desperate strength, as if she could somehow make up for 3 years of believing he was dead. "I missed you so much, Papa. I missed you too, Mija, more than you'll ever know." As they held each other under the desert stars, Elena realized that her story had come full circle in the most unexpected way possible. She had been sold by her mother, saved by a stranger, and now discovered that the stranger was her father, a man who had sacrificed everything to find her and bring her home. But more than that, she had discovered something about herself in the process. She was not a victim to be bought and sold. She was not property to be owned and traded. She was Elena Reyes, daughter of Miguel Reyes, and she was free. The next morning brought news that Consuela Reyes had been found dead in her cabin, apparently, from a combination of alcohol poisoning and what the doctor called a broken heart. Elena felt sadness for the woman her mother had once been, but she could not mourn the woman her mother had become. 3 months later, Elena stood in the garden, behind the ranch house, watching her father work with a young horse that had been running wild in the mountains. The animal was skittish and afraid, but Miguel's patience and gentle persistence were slowly earning its trust. "Some things can't be rushed," Miguel said, noticing her watching. "Healing takes time, whether it's for horses or people." Elena nodded, understanding that he was talking about more than just the horse. Her own healing was still ongoing, but she could feel herself growing stronger each day. The nightmares were becoming less frequent, and she was beginning to believe that she truly was safe, truly free, truly home. "Papa," she said quietly. "What happens now?" Miguel smiled, the same gentle smile she remembered from her childhood. "Now we live, mija. We live free, and we help others find their freedom too." Elena thought about the locket around her neck, about the mother she had never known who had died giving her life, about the father who had never stopped searching for her, and about the future that stretched out before them like an endless sky full of possibilities. "I'd like that," she said simply, and as the sun set over the hidden valley that had become their sanctuary, Elena Reyes looked toward the horizon, not with fear or uncertainty but with hope. She was no longer the girl who had been sold at auction. She was no longer the victim of other people's choices and failures. She was free, and she was home, and she was exactly where she belonged. 2 years had passed since the confrontation on the mesa, and the hidden valley had transformed from a place of solitude into something resembling a small community. What had once been Miguel's solitary refuge had become known throughout the territory by a name that was whispered with reverence and hope. El Santuario, the Sanctuary. Elena stood on the porch of the main house, now expanded to include additional rooms and a large common area, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. At 19, she had grown into a woman whose beauty was matched only by her strength of character. The frightened girl, who had once stood on an auction block, had been replaced by someone who carried herself with the quiet confidence of a person who had found her purpose in life. "Miss Elena," came a soft voice from behind her. "Sarah's asking for you again." Elena turned to see Maria Santos, a woman in her 30s, who had arrived at the sanctuary 6 months earlier with 3 children and scars that told a story of unimaginable suffering. Maria had become Eleanor's assistant and closest friend, helping to manage the day-to-day operations of what had evolved into something far more complex than a simple ranch. "How is she this morning?" Elena asked, referring to Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year-old girl who had been rescued from a trafficking ring in Tucson just 3 weeks earlier. "Better," Maria replied with a small smile. "She ate breakfast without anyone having to coax her, and she's been asking about the horses." Elena nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of hope and protective concern that came with each new arrival at the sanctuary. Sarah's case had been particularly difficult. The girl had been so traumatized by her experiences that she hadn't spoken a word for the first 2 weeks after her rescue. But Elena had learned that horses had a way of reaching people when human. Words failed, and she had been patiently working with Sarah to rebuild her trust in the world. The transformation of the valley into a sanctuary hadn't been planned. It had begun 3 months after Marcus Blade's arrest, when Sheriff Harrison had arrived with a 12-year-old girl named Rosa, who had been found chained in a mining camp. The girl had nowhere to go, no family to claim her, and the county had no facilities equipped to help someone so young deal with such trauma. "Would you be willing to take her in for a while?" Harrison had asked. "Just until we can find something more permanent." Elena had looked at the terrified child, seeing her own past reflected in those hollow eyes, and had known that there was no choice to be made. Rosa stayed, and gradually word spread through the network of law enforcement officers, church leaders, and social reformers who were working to combat human trafficking. More girls came, then women with children, then entire families who had lost everything to predators like Blade. Miguel had supported Elena's vision from the beginning, using his savings to expand the buildings and purchase supplies. But it was Elena who had developed the innovative approach that made the sanctuary truly unique. Rather than simply providing temporary shelter, she had created a comprehensive program that addressed both the practical and emotional needs of survivors. "Tell Sarah I'll be there in a few minutes," Eleanor told Maria. "I want to check on the new arrivals first." Eleanor walked toward the newly constructed dormitory building, where 3 women and their children had arrived the previous evening. They had been rescued from a brothel in Phoenix, and Elena knew from experience that the first few days would be crucial in helping them begin to heal. She found the women sitting together in the common room, their children playing quietly nearby with toys that had been donated by families throughout the territory. The oldest woman, perhaps 40, looked up as Elena entered, her eyes holding the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "Good morning," Elena said gently, settling into a chair across from them. "I'm Elena Reyes. How did everyone sleep?" "Better than we have in months," the woman replied cautiously. "I'm Catherine Williams. These are my friends, Anne and Beth." Eleanor nodded, remembering her own first days at the sanctuary. The disbelief that such kindness could exist without hidden motives, the fear that it was all too good to be true. "I know this is all very new and probably overwhelming," Elena said. "There's no pressure to do anything or decide anything right away. Your only job right now is to rest and heal." "What happens to us now?" asked Anne, a younger woman with a baby in her arms. "The sheriff said this was temporary until they could find us places to go." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the fear behind the question. "That's entirely up to you. Some women stay here for a few weeks while they figure out their next steps. Others have stayed for months or even longer. We have women who've been here for over a year, and they're now helping new arrivals adjust." She gestured toward the window, where they could see Maria working in the garden with several other women. "We've built something here that's more than just a shelter. It's a community. Everyone contributes what they can, when they can. Some women work with the horses, others help with cooking or childcare or maintaining the buildings. Some have started small businesses. We have a woman who makes the most beautiful pottery you've ever seen, and another who's become an expert at preserving food." "And you don't charge us anything?" Beth asked suspiciously. "Nothing," Elena confirmed. "This place exists because people believe that everyone deserves a chance to start over, to live free from fear. We're supported by donations from throughout the territory and by the work we do here. The horses we train are sold to ranchers, who know they're getting animals that have been handled with care and patience." As Elena spoke, she could see the gradual relaxation in the women's postures. This conversation was one she'd had dozens of times over the past 2 years, and she'd learned that the key was not to overwhelm newcomers with too much information, but to let them discover gradually that the sanctuary was exactly what it appeared, to be a safe place where they could rebuild their lives at their own pace. After spending an hour with the new arrivals, Elena made her way to the horse paddock, where she found Sarah standing at the fence, watching a young mare that Miguel had rescued from an abusive owner. The horse, named Luna for the white crescent marking on her forehead, had been as traumatized as many of the human survivors who came to the sanctuary. "She's beautiful," Sarah said quietly as Elena approached. The first words Elena had heard her speak in over a week. "She is," Elena agreed, leaning against the fence beside Sarah. "She's also very scared. She's been hurt badly, and she doesn't trust people anymore." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. "How do you help her?" "Patience," Elena said simply. "We don't rush her. We don't force her to do anything she's not ready for. We just show up every day and prove that we're safe, that we won't hurt her." Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a carrot, offering it to Sarah. "Would you like to try feeding her?" Sarah took the carrot with hands that trembled slightly, but she didn't hesitate as she extended it toward Luna. The mare approached, cautiously, her ears forward but ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. When she finally took the carrot from Sarah's hand, both girl and horse seemed to breathe a little easier. "She's starting to trust," Sarah observed. "Just like you are," Eleanor said gently. Sarah looked at Eleanor with eyes that held depths of pain. No 15-year-old should have experienced. "Do you think I'll ever be normal again?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. It was one she'd been asked many times, and she'd learned that honesty was more helpful than false reassurance. "I think you'll be Sarah again," she said finally. "Maybe not exactly the same Sarah you were before, but the real Sarah, the one who loves horses and has a beautiful smile and deserves to be happy. The trauma you've experienced will always be part of your story, but it doesn't have to define your story." "Is that what happened to you?" Sarah asked. Elena touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling the familiar comfort of Isabella's picture. "Inside, yes. I was sold at an auction when I was 16. I thought my life was over, that I would never be anything more than what those men wanted me to be. But I was wrong. I found out that I was stronger than I knew, braver than I believed, and worthy of love and respect." Sarah's eyes widened. "You were sold too." "I was, by my own mother, to pay her gambling debts." Eleanor's voice remained steady, though she could feel the old pain stirring. "It was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, but it also led me to discover who I really was and what I was capable of. And now you help other people like us." "Now I help other people like us," Elena confirmed, "because I learned that surviving something terrible can be the beginning of something beautiful, if you're willing to fight for it." That evening, Elena found herself in the office she had set up in what had once been her father's study, reviewing the correspondence that had grown increasingly complex as the sanctuary's reputation spread. There were letters from law enforcement agencies throughout the Southwest asking for help with trafficking victims. There were requests from church groups wanting to visit and offer support. There were inquiries from other communities interested in establishing similar sanctuaries. But tonight, one letter in particular captured her attention. It was from the Territorial Governor's Office, written in the formal language of official business. "Miss Reyes, it has come to our attention that the work being done at your facility represents a significant contribution to the welfare and safety of the citizens of Arizona Territory. We would like to extend an invitation for you to address the territorial legislature regarding the establishment of official protocols for assisting victims of human trafficking." Elena read the letter twice, hardly believing what she was seeing. 2 years ago, she had been considered property to be bought and sold. Now she was being invited to help shape territorial policy on one of the region's most pressing social issues. "Good news," Miguel asked from the doorway. Elena looked up at her father, marveling, as she always did, at how much their relationship had healed and grown. Miguel had aged in the 2 years since their reunion, but it was the aging of a man who had found peace rather than one consumed by grief and guilt. His hair was more silver now, and there were lines around his eyes, but there was also a contentment in his bearing that spoke of a life lived with purpose. "The governor wants me to speak to the territorial legislature," Elena said, still processing the implications. "About creating official programs to help trafficking victims." Miguel smiled, the expression lighting up his entire face. "I'm proud of you, Mija. You've taken something terrible and transformed it into something that gives hope to hundreds of people." "We've done that," Elena corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you. You give me too much credit. You're the one who saw what this place could become. You're the one who had the vision to create something that had never existed before." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out over the valley that had become home to so many people seeking a second chance. In the distance, she could see Maria and several other women working in the vegetable garden by lamplight, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Closer to the house, she could see Sarah sitting on the porch with Luna, who had become calm enough to accept gentle petting. "Do you think Isabella would be proud of what we've built here?" Elena asked quietly. Miguel moved to stand beside her, following her gaze across the sanctuary. "I think your mother would be amazed by the woman you've become. She gave her life so that you could live, and you've used that life to save others. If that's not something to be proud of, I don't know what is. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me in time. What would have become of me if Blade had won that day? But he didn't win," Miguel said firmly. "Evil rarely wins when good people are willing to fight against it. You fought, I fought, Sheriff Harrison fought, even little Carmen fought by bringing us that warning. And because we all fought, you're here. This place exists, and dozens of people have been given the chance to rebuild their lives." Elena nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. The girl who had once felt powerless had discovered that she possessed a strength she had never known existed. More importantly, she had learned that strength was not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared with others who needed it. "I think I'll accept the governor's invitation," she said finally. "Good. What will you tell them?" Elena considered the question, thinking about all the women and children who had found their way to the sanctuary, about the lives that had been rebuilt from the ashes of trauma and despair. "I'll tell them that freedom isn't something that can be given or taken away by other people. It's something that lives inside each person, and it can't be destroyed, no matter what happens to them. But I'll also tell them that sometimes people need help, remembering that they're free, and that it's our responsibility as a community to provide that help." Miguel smiled. "That sounds like something Isabella would say." Elena touched the locket at her throat, feeling the presence of the mother she had never known, but whose legacy lived on in everything she did. "I hope so." As night settled over the valley, Eleanor made her final rounds, checking on the women and children who had found refuge in the sanctuary. In the dormitory, she found Catherine reading a story to her young son, both of them looking more relaxed than they had that morning. In the common room, Anne was teaching several other women how to knit, their conversation punctuated by gentle laughter. Sarah was in her room, sketching in a journal that Elena had given her as a way to express feelings that were still too difficult to put into words. The girl looked up as Elena knocked on her doorframe. "Miss Elena, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think I could learn to work with the horses, like you do?" Elena smiled, feeling her heart swell with pride and hope. "I think you'd be wonderful with the horses. Luna already trusts you more than she trusts most people." "I'd like that. I'd like to help other people the way you've helped me." "Then that's what you'll do," Elena said simply, "when you're ready." As Elena finally made her way to her own room, she paused at the window that looked out over the mesa where she had been. Reunited with her father, the desert stretched out endlessly under a canopy of stars, beautiful and harsh and full of possibilities. She thought about the letter from the governor, about the opportunity to influence policy that could help thousands of people throughout the territory. She thought about Sarah's desire to help others, about Maria's transformation from victim to leader, about all the women who had found their strength within the walls of the sanctuary. Most of all, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the auction block to this place of healing and hope. It had been a journey marked by betrayal and violence, by fear and desperation. But it had also been a journey of discovery, of learning that the human spirit could not be Broken no matter how cruel the world became, Elena Reyes had been sold like property, hunted like an animal, and written off as lost. But she had refused to accept those definitions of herself. Instead, she had chosen to become something else entirely, a beacon of hope for others who found themselves in darkness, a reminder that freedom was not something that could be bought or sold, but something that lived in the hearts of those brave enough to claim it. As she prepared for bed, Elena looked once more at the letter from the governor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference in the world. But tonight, she was content to be exactly where she was, home, safe, surrounded by people who had become her family, and finally, completely free. The girl who had once been sold at auction had become a woman who was helping to reshape the very concept of justice in the American Southwest. And in a territory where the line between civilization and savagery was often razor thin, Elena Reyes and her sanctuary had become proof that sometimes, if you fought hard enough and refused to give up, love could triumph over greed, hope could conquer despair, and the powerless could find their voices and use them to change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.